In the last several videos, I've talked to you about how the companies that make story have adopted business models that in many ways make it irrelevant whether you like or consume their products. They still win, they still make money. I also promised you that starting today, we begin the process of spending more time finding and consuming material that will actually have value to us. But first we need to start by understanding the process by which streaming services hack your brain. Not so much that you watch things that you'd never want to see, more that you'd watch things you'd never pick on your own. In fact, streaming services use the fact that they understand how your brain works better than you to essentially hack your habits. What we're going to learn today won't just improve your understanding of story, it will improve your understanding and mastery of yourself. I'm Logan, and this is Intensely Casual. The purpose of all apps, whether it be gacha games, streaming services, social media, is to keep you using the app as much as possible. Reed Hastings of Netflix famously said that Netflix's biggest competitor was sleep. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. Netflix actually has the goal of getting you to sleep less, which can't be good for you, right? Now, every service brags that it's really good at giving you the content that you want, but they all go out of your way to actually limit your agency to go get it on your own. What I mean by this is prior to streaming, it was fairly easy to organize your media in services like Winamp or iTunes or VLC. There were all sorts of different ways you could organize it, right? You could organize it into playlists, you could organize it into collections, you could organize it in terms of albums. And you could do all sorts of things with these. Like you could set them in whatever order you wanted. You could shuffle them if you wanted. But in the streaming realm, every service has some weird organizational gap. For instance, Netflix doesn't let you create playlists. In YouTube, you can't organize your subscriptions and save folders. Although I believe at one time you could do that. You can't do it now. Spotify loves pushing you into shuffle setting. Now, the reason they do this is based on the type of content you're consuming. This will guide you to their preferred content and hopefully prevent you from closing the loop on the experience, because our brains hate open loops. And what I mean by this is if you listen to an album from start to finish and you're familiar with that album, like when I was a kid, I really liked U2's Octoon Baby. When you get to the album, you know you're at the end of the album. But if they play it on shuffle, you're not quite sure when you're at the end of the album, and then they can start serving you more music. And they always put in music that you haven't heard that they want you to get exposed to. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing. It's about them controlling the experience. Netflix, on the other hand, doesn't like playlists at all, because they want you to rely on the story to carry you from episode to episode. Okay, so if you took a show like Friends, right, and you just shuffled it, what would happen to be very easy to quit after one episode. This has a bizarre effect, though, by the way, and I can talk about this some other time, kind of, I think, ruins Friends, because Friends was not meant to be watched in order. Even in its first run, it was only meant to be watched one season's worth of episodes at a time. In syndication, the episodes were all really shuffled. Friends wasn't meant to be experienced in the linear fashion that you have to experience it on a streaming service, or at least that it's very hard to not experience it that way. YouTube doesn't want you organizing your subscriptions, because then you could say, today I want to watch videos about aquariums. I'll go to my aquariums folder, I'll watch the current videos on aquariums, and when I'm done with that, I quit. In every case, what the streamer wants is for you not to quit. So what I'm about to say might seem a little weird to you, but I would encourage you that discomfort is almost always a feeling that goes along with growth. What these programmers understand is that our brains consist of two systems. System one is emotional. It's fast, it's efficient, it recognizes patterns, it creates habits. It generates our emotions and our intuitions, and it's the root of our personality. And in fact, you really can't say you've learned something until system one has learned it. This system one is the one that you'll find in all mammals, certainly, and pretty much most animals to one degree or another. But humans have developed a system 2 on top of system 1, which is a slower, colder, more rational system. This system takes effort to use, is a little frustrating to use, and it's the system that thinks about the future. It's the system that fundamentally we use when we think to ourselves in words, and it's the system we think of as ourselves. We say, I think, that's what our system 2 thinks. This is not a new idea. The Greeks had this idea of that people had a tension between reason and passion. Buddhists have this idea of anatman, that there's a non-self, that what we think of as a self is all these different parts that are interconnected with each other. Freud had this idea that we had a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. The idea of system 1 and system 2, that formulation comes from Nobel Prize winning scientist Daniel Kahneman and his research partner Amos Tversky. Jonathan Haidt has a great way of putting this. Basically, he calls system 1 the elephant and System 2, the rider. So let me explain this elephant and rider thing real quick. If you've ever heard the phrase that we only use 10% of our brains to think, first of all, wherever that came from, it's not really a scientific idea. But what they were getting at is only about 10% of our brains is the rational System 2 thinky part. The other 90%, the much larger part, is System 1. Hence, elephant is the 90%, rider is the 10%. The elephant can get most things done on its own. What System 2, the rider, does, System 2 is what lets you be proactive, make plans, make choices, figure out things that aren't obvious. For instance, when you decide to save money for retirement, you're using your System 2. System 1 would be very happy to spend and enjoy the money today, but System 2 knows that there's a day coming you might not be able to work so easily and you might need that money. Although these two systems work together, they don't do it perfectly. System 1 doesn't really speak in words. It speaks in images and intuitions, hunches, emotions. System 2 tends to speak in words that System 1 doesn't always believe. Although they work together, these two systems struggle to communicate with each other, and they tend to suppress each other sometimes. For instance, System 1 typically doesn't use words to communicate things to our System 2 minds, so it generates feelings, intuitions, emotions. On the other hand, System 2 sometimes can't convince System 1 to do something. And a great example of this is if you've ever, let's say you have to make a left turn to go to work, but one day you're on the same route, but you're not going to work, you're going to a store, you need to make a right turn. You know, your System 2 knows you need to make a right turn. You're going to the store and not work. But what do? You make a left turn, and you say, force a habit. That's System 1. That's that interference between the two. When System 1 is really active and you're experiencing a lot of emotions, it can be impossible to activate System 2. This is why people who are panicking often hurt themselves when there may have been very easy solutions to solve their problem. With their emotions so strongly engaged, they just could not access System 2. At the same time, someone whose System 2 is active actually has their emotions suppressed, and this is why disbelief in stories are always bad. You're not nitpicking. A moment that provokes your disbelief literally destroys the emotional appeal of the story. Pretty much all social media apps, streaming apps, gacha games, all work by trying to keep your System 1 elephant active and engaged in habit loops that you aren't fully conscious of, and they want to keep your System 2 rider dormant. The reason they do this is that they have spent a lot of time and energy studying the science of how your brain works to create something called persuasive technology. Technology that trains you to do what they want. And they do this by making it harder to do what you want and easier to do what they want. I'm going to use Netflix here as my primary example. So there's a weird thing that happens with Netflix that I've noticed, where Netflix has content that I want and that it could recommend to me, but instead it will recommend to me things I absolutely don't want to watch that Netflix should know I don't want to watch. The first really great example of this was Bird Box, which was on my Apple TV, my Spotlight pick for like 3 weeks. I don't like horror movies. I don't watch a lot of horror movies. I have not watched horror movies, or very many, on Netflix. There's no reason for Netflix to think that was the movie for me. And it's not just that it misunderstood how I feel about horror movies. When Bridgerton came out, every time I finished an episode of something, every time I finished a movie, they would be like, oh, you want to watch Bridgerton then? I do not like most Victorian fiction. I don't like most Victorian stories, with the possible exception of like Victorian horror, like Dracula or Frankenstein. And I realize that's like the most perverse thing in the world, right? I just say I don't like horror and I don't like Victorian stories, but you put them together, it works. I don't know why that is. Life is strange. The point is, I kept having to actively choose not to watch these things. You might say, what's the wrong with that, Logan? Be on guard. Use your willpower. But remember, if I am constantly having to activate System 2 to keep Netflix on track to give me what I want, I'm suppressing my positive emotions. Why do you think I was watching television in the first place? Me, I like comedies. I want to laugh. I don't want to have to do something that will suppress my ability to enjoy humor before I start watching a comedy. Each of these services wants to keep you from closing the loop on your habits, because if you keep your System 1 active by not closing the loop, by always going into another habit, System 1 never activates System 2. The elephant never asks the rider, where do we go next? Because if the loop closed, you almost certainly would activate the rider. And then you probably decide to go do something else with your life. Think of the end of a movie in theaters. No matter how engrossed you were in that movie, how deeply in the flow state you were, you get to the end of the movie, the credits start to roll, the lights come up, System 1 is cued. We're done with this movie experience, and your emotions diminish. And you say to yourself, okay, now what do I want to do? And you go on, you move on with your day. All right. This is why, as I said before, all of these apps have weird organizational gaps. It's not that they haven't considered the idea of putting these features in. It's not that these features get in the way of your positive experience. It's that these features would make it easier for you to choose to stop. And the whole thing reminds me of the way people force feed geese to create foie gras, fatty liver, right? The geese won't eat enough grain on their own to generate this sort of fatty liver, right? So they force feed the goose. They don't force feed the goose because it's good for the goose. They force feed the goose because it's good for the people who are going to eat the goose. All of this serves the needs of the programmers, of the app makers, not yours. In each case, the service actively prevents you from getting what you want in order to manipulate you into consuming the material that's best for them. So the first step to escaping captive fandom and streamer dependence, to becoming an aficionado, is to begin to set intentions about what you want to experience. For example, you could subscribe to this channel and like this video. You could also subscribe to my podcast, The Intensely Casual Commentaries. Finally, you could also check out my book, The Intensely Casual Guide to Good Story, at Amazon, Google, Kobo, and Barnes & Noble. Each of these choices is an intention. Neither of us wants you to have to depend on me. So here's what you can do on your own. As soon as possible, make a list of like 2 to 5 movies or TV shows you've been meaning to watch but haven't gotten around to. The longer you've waited, the better. Then try to find one of those on one of the streaming services you have access to and start watching it, all right? Use this to open a loop for yourself, because one of 2 things are gonna happen. Even if you don't have time to finish it, by starting it, you're either going to fail to engage with it, in which case you don't wanna waste any more time with it, or you will engage with it, in which case you will want to close that loop. You will use the same features the streamers use against you yourself. Your rider becomes the person in control of your elephant, not the streamers pretending to be your rider. If you want to know more about being an active consumer of story in the 21st century, come back next week or check out my last video.